On the evening of March 9th, 1983, an 8-year-old girl in Budapest overheard a conversation that would lead to her parents' execution. Her name was Eszter Kovács. Her father, Laszlo, was a mid-level translator at a government ministry in the city. Her mother, Kádár, worked as a librarian at the State Technical University. By all accounts, they were unremarkable Hungarian citizens, the kind of family that kept their heads down, followed the rules, and avoided trouble. But, sometime in early 1983, they made a decision that would cost them everything. They decided to defect. The details of how they arrived at this decision are not entirely clear. What we do know is that Laszlo and Kádár had been approved for a work-related trip to Czechoslovakia in late April of that year. Czechoslovakia was part of the Eastern Bloc, a safe destination for Hungarian citizens, and the approval process for such trips was routine. But the Kovács family wasn't planning to return. According to later interrogation records, they intended to cross into Austria while in Czechoslovakia and from there make their way to a Western embassy, where they hoped to claim asylum. It was a plan that required absolute secrecy. Any leak, any suspicion, any indication that they were preparing to leave permanently would have been enough to trigger an investigation. And that's exactly what happened. Understanding why the Kovács family wanted to leave requires understanding what life was like in Hungary in 1983. This was the tail end of the Kádár era, a period when the Hungarian economy was showing signs of strain, despite being relatively more open than other Eastern Bloc countries. The ideological pressure remained constant, and for those with education and access to information from the West, the limitations felt increasingly suffocating. Laszlo Kovács had worked at the Ministry of Trade since 1977. His job involved translating technical documents and correspondence related to trade agreements with other socialist countries. It wasn't classified work at the highest levels, but it was sensitive enough that his employment file was maintained by the ministry's security department, and his activities were subject to periodic review. Government employees were always watched more carefully than ordinary citizens. Kádár worked at the Technical University Library, managing collections and helping students and faculty locate research materials. She'd been working there for 10 years by 1983, and according to former colleagues interviewed years later, she was efficient and well-regarded. But working in an academic environment meant constant awareness of what materials were acceptable and what might be considered subversive. Western journals were restricted, certain topics were off-limits, and every interaction was potentially monitored. They had one child, Eszter, born in May of 1974. She was a bright girl, observant and curious, according to her teachers. She attended school number 12 in the Józsefváros district. Her friends described her in later interviews as thoughtful and serious, the kind of child who noticed details others missed. The Kovács family lived in a standard apartment complex on Üllői Road, a concrete structure built in the 1960s. The apartment was modest, 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, a bathroom with unreliable heating. It was typical for a family of 3 in Budapest at the time. Their neighbors were a mix of workers, clerks, and pensioners. The walls were thin, and privacy was limited. Eszter later told a family friend in one of the few conversations they had about that period that she'd been listening outside her parents' bedroom when she heard them discussing the trip. She said she'd noticed something was different in the weeks leading up to that night. Her parents had been anxious, speaking in hushed tones that stopped abruptly when she entered the room. There had been tension at meals, long silences where conversation should have been. That night, she heard them talking about Czechoslovakia, about the trip they'd been approved to take, but they weren't discussing work or tourism. They were talking about Austria, about crossing the border, about someone who might help them once they got there. Her father's voice was strained, urgent. Her mother sounded afraid but determined. She said something about not wanting to raise their daughter in a system where every thought had to be carefully guarded, where the future was controlled by party membership and political conformity. Eszter didn't understand everything they were saying, but she understood enough. They were planning to leave and not come back. They were talking about the West. Her parents discovered her listening. According to Eszter, her father opened the door and found her standing there in the hallway. He brought her into the room, and both her parents sat her down. They told her very clearly that she needed to forget what she'd heard. Her mother was crying, gripping her hands tightly. They explained that it was just talk, nothing more, but that she absolutely could not repeat it to anyone. Not to her friends at school, not to her teachers, not to anyone. She promised, but promises made by 8-year-olds, even sincere ones, are fragile things under pressure. Over the next 3 weeks, Eszter began to notice things that confirmed what she'd overheard. Her mother was sorting through belongings in ways that seemed odd for a work trip. She carefully wrapped her grandmother's silver brooch, a family piece that Kádár treasured, and placed it in a small box. She organized photo albums, removing pictures from frames and packing them carefully. She folded documents, birth certificates, and family papers into an envelope that she tucked into a suitcase. These were not the actions of people planning a brief trip across the border. These were the actions of people who were leaving forever. Eszter understood that, even if she couldn't fully articulate why, and the weight of that understanding, combined with the secret she'd promised to keep, must have been enormous for a child that age. In late March, less than 4 weeks before the family was scheduled to leave for Czechoslovakia, Eszter was at school during lunch period with her closest friend, a 9-year-old girl named Klára Molnár. The two had known each other since kindergarten. They sat together in class, walked home together most afternoons, spent weekends playing in the courtyard of their apartment buildings. Klára's family lived 3 blocks from the Kovács apartment, and the girls considered each other inseparable. At some point during that lunch period, while they sat on a bench in the schoolyard, Eszter told Klára that her family was leaving. She said they were going west and wouldn't be coming back. She said it quietly, almost as if testing the words, but she said it. We don't know exactly how the conversation unfolded. We don't know if Klára asked questions or if Eszter volunteered details. What we do know is that Klára believed her, and that belief was strong enough that when she went home that afternoon, she told her parents what her friend had said. And this is where the story takes its turn, because Klára's father was a state security officer. János Molnár worked for the AVH, the State Protection Authority, Hungary's secret police. He'd been with the organization since 1972, working his way up from administrative duties to a position in the counterintelligence division. By all accounts, he was a dedicated officer, the kind of man who believed deeply in protecting the socialist state from internal and external threats. When his daughter came home with this information, János didn't dismiss it as children's gossip. According to later reports, he questioned Klára carefully. He wanted to know exactly what Eszter had said, where the conversation had taken place, whether anyone else had been present. Klára answered honestly. She was 9 years old, and she trusted her father completely. She had no reason to think that sharing this information would lead to anything harmful. She thought perhaps he might talk to Eszter's parents, warn them, help them somehow. But János Molnár understood the gravity of what he'd been told. He knew that László Kovács worked for a government ministry, had access to official documents and correspondence. He knew that defection by a government employee was considered a serious security threat, and he knew that even second-hand information from a child needed to be reported through proper channels. The next morning, March 22, 1983, János filed a report with his superior officer at the AVH headquarters. The report was concise, noting the source as his daughter, Klára, and acknowledging that the information came second-hand from another child. But he also noted the potential severity if it proved accurate. He included László's workplace affiliation and the fact that the family had an approved trip abroad scheduled for late April. The report moved quickly through the chain of command. Within 48 hours, it had reached the desk of an officer in the counterintelligence division, responsible for monitoring government employees. The AVH received countless reports every month. The Hungarian system, like other Eastern Bloc countries, encouraged citizens to inform on suspicious behavior. Most of these reports were trivial, born from personal disputes or misunderstandings, but this report had elements that warranted attention. First, the subject was a government employee with access to official communications. Even though László's position wasn't particularly sensitive, any government worker attempting to leave the country represented a potential security breach. The concern wasn't necessarily that László possessed critical state secrets, but rather that his defection might encourage others, might suggest weakness in the system's control. Second, the family had an approved foreign trip approaching. The timing raised immediate suspicion. Third, however, was the problem. The source of the information was a 9-year-old child who'd heard it from an 8-year-old. That made the intelligence inherently questionable. Children misunderstood conversations, exaggerated stories, sometimes fabricated things entirely. The AVH couldn't simply arrest László Kovács based on words exchanged between 2 schoolgirls. They needed confirmation, they needed evidence, and they needed it before the family boarded a train to Czechoslovakia. So, they initiated surveillance. The decision would have been made at the divisional level, and a case file was opened. Officers were assigned to monitor the Kovács family's activities. The surveillance operation that began on March 24, 1983 was relatively standard for this type of investigation. Officers watched the apartment building, noting when László left for work each morning and when he returned each evening. They tracked Katalin's movements as well, following her to the university library, to shops, back home. They placed monitoring on the apartment's telephone line, though records indicate the Kovács family used their phone infrequently during this period. The AVH also reviewed László's employment file at the ministry. They searched for irregularities, signs of discontent, Ideological deviation. They checked whether he'd requested access to materials outside his normal work scope, whether colleagues had noticed anything unusual about his behavior. They found nothing alarming in the documentation. Laszlo appeared to be a competent and unremarkable employee, but the surveillance team remained patient. They were looking for something specific: contact with a facilitator, unusual meetings, preparations that would indicate intent to defect. And on March 29th, 5 days after surveillance began, and roughly 4 weeks before the family's scheduled departure, they found what they were looking for. Laszlo met with a man at a cafe near the Danube. The cafe was small, the kind of place where office workers stopped for coffee during their breaks. The meeting occurred around 5 in the afternoon, after Laszlo had finished work. He sat at a corner table with a man the surveillance team recognized immediately. The man's name was Peter Sabo, and he had a file with the AVH. Sabo was suspected of being a facilitator, someone who helped arrange illegal border crossings for people attempting to flee Hungary. He'd been under intermittent surveillance for nearly 2 years, but the AVH had never gathered sufficient evidence to arrest him. He was cautious, meeting people briefly in public places, never staying long enough to be caught doing anything explicitly criminal. The meeting between Laszlo and Sabo lasted less than 15 minutes. They spoke quietly, leaning close. No documents were visibly exchanged. When they separated, it was quick, without gestures that might indicate familiarity. But the meeting itself, combined with the initial report from Janos Molnar, constituted enough evidence of intent. The AVH moved decisively. There was no time for extended surveillance, no opportunity to gather additional evidence. The family was scheduled to leave in less than 4 weeks. If the Kovács family managed to cross into Czechoslovakia, and from there into Austria, the AVH would lose them, and losing a government employee to the West would be both an intelligence failure and a propaganda disaster for the Hungarian state. On the evening of April 1st, 1983, 2 unmarked sedans arrived in front of the apartment complex on Üllői Road. 6 plainclothes officers entered the building and climbed the stairs to the 4th floor. Several neighbors later described what happened. There was a firm knock on the Kovács apartment door. When Laszlo opened it, the officers identified themselves and informed him he needed to accompany them for questioning. Catalin appeared behind him, demanding to know what was happening, what the charges were. The officers told her she needed to come as well. Eszter was in the apartment. According to one neighbor who witnessed the scene from their doorway, the girl was brought out by one of the officers, visibly distressed and calling for her mother. Catalin tried to reach for her, but the officers kept them separated. Eszter was placed in a different vehicle than her parents. She never saw them again. Laszlo and Catalin Kovács were taken to separate detention facilities operated by the AVH. Eszter was brought to a state children's institution on the outskirts of Budapest, a place where children whose parents were arrested or deemed unfit were temporarily housed while their cases were processed. The interrogations of Laszlo and Catalin began immediately. Interrogation techniques used by the AVH during this period are well documented. They involved isolation, psychological pressure, sleep deprivation, and relentless questioning designed to break down resistance and extract confessions. The interrogators had the surveillance evidence, documentation of the meeting with Sabo, telephone monitoring records, whatever they'd gathered during the brief surveillance operation. But they wanted more. They wanted full confessions, details about the plan, names of anyone else involved. Laszlo held out for several days, according to interrogation logs later recovered from archives. He initially denied any intention to defect, claimed the meeting with Sabo was coincidental, insisted the trip to Czechoslovakia was purely for work purposes. But on the 6th day of interrogation, he broke. He confessed that he and Catalin had been planning to defect for approximately 5 months. He said they'd made contact with Sabo through an acquaintance whose name he refused to provide. He explained that the plan was to travel to Czechoslovakia, as approved, then cross into Austria through a forested border area that Sabo had identified. From Austria, they intended to reach a Western embassy and claim asylum. He admitted that he understood this was illegal, that he was betraying the Hungarian People's Republic, but he insisted he'd done it for his daughter. He said he wanted Eszter to grow up in a place where she could think freely, where her future wasn't determined by party loyalty and ideological conformity. Catalin was interrogated separately, and she corroborated Laszlo's confession. She admitted she'd known about the plan, agreed to it, participated in preparations. She told them about the items she'd packed, the family heirlooms and documents, the things she couldn't bear to leave behind. Under Hungarian law at the time, attempted defection by a government employee was classified as treason. The legal framework defined treason as an act committed by a citizen to the detriment of the state's sovereignty and security. Defection fell under this category. particularly when the individual had access to any official information or worked in a government capacity. The penalty for treason was death. There was no ambiguity in the law, no provision for mitigating circumstances. Intent was sufficient for conviction. The fact that Laszlo and Katalin had not actually defected yet, that they'd been arrested before leaving Budapest, made no difference under the legal framework. The trial was held in a closed proceeding on May 17, 1983. These proceedings were not public. No journalists attended, no outside observers were permitted. The proceedings were recorded in written form only, and the records were immediately classified. The trial lasted approximately 3 hours. The prosecution presented the evidence, the surveillance reports, documentation of the meeting with Szabó, the signed confessions. No meaningful defense was mounted, which was typical in treason cases of this nature. The concept of presumption of innocence, while theoretically part of Hungarian law, was functionally irrelevant in cases involving state security. The verdict was delivered the same day. Both Laszlo Kovács and Katalin Kovács were found guilty of treason. They were sentenced to death by firing squad. There was no appeal process for treason convictions in cases involving state security. The sentence was final. On May 21, 1983, at approximately 6 in the morning, Laszlo and Katalin Kovács were executed at a facility outside Budapest. The executions were carried out by a military firing squad, which was standard procedure for treason cases. Their bodies were not returned to family. They were buried in unmarked graves at an undisclosed location. Their deaths were not announced publicly. No obituary appeared in any newspaper. Their names were removed from official records wherever possible. The apartment on Üllői Road was reassigned to another family within 3 weeks. Eszter, meanwhile, had been placed in the state care system. The facility where she'd initially been taken was temporary. Within 2 weeks of her parents' arrest, she was transferred to a children's home in the countryside, approximately 150 kilometers from Budapest. Her grandmother, Katalin's mother, arrived at the facility in Budapest 6 days after the arrest. Her name was Margit Horváth, and she was 61 years old at the time. She'd been widowed for 9 years and lived on a modest pension in a small apartment in the Ferencváros district. When she learned that her daughter and son-in-law had been arrested, she immediately went to the authorities to request custody of Eszter. She was denied. The reasoning, according to documents later obtained from state archives, was that children of convicted traitors required special supervision to ensure proper ideological re-education. The state considered these children to be at risk of inheriting their parents' anti-socialist tendencies, and standard procedure was to place them in state-run facilities, where their education and development could be closely monitored. Margit was allowed to visit Eszter, but only under supervision, and only at scheduled intervals. She was not permitted to take her home. She appealed the decision multiple times over the following months, submitting letters to various administrative offices, pleading with officials, insisting that she was a loyal citizen and could provide a proper upbringing for her granddaughter. Every appeal was denied. The last time she saw Eszter as a child was in October of 1983 at the children's home in the countryside. She'd taken a train to visit, bringing a small package of sweets and a photograph of Katalin from when she was young. Eszter asked her where her parents were. Margit didn't know what to tell her. The authorities hadn't informed her of the execution, had only told her that the case was closed and that Laszlo and Katalin would not be returning. She told Eszter her parents were away, that they would come back when they could. It was a lie, but she didn't know what else to say to an 8-year-old girl. Eszter spent the next 10 years in the state care system. She was moved between facilities multiple times, a common practice intended to prevent children from forming strong attachments to any particular location or staff. She spent time in different institutions, was enrolled in state schools, given standard education, taught the approved curriculum. People who knew her during those years described her as withdrawn and reserved. She didn't make friends easily, didn't participate in group activities, spent most of her time reading or keeping to herself. Teachers noted that she was intelligent, but showed little motivation, completing assignments adequately, but showing no particular enthusiasm for anything. Her grandmother visited when she could, though the visits became less frequent as Margit aged and her health declined. The emotional burden of losing her daughter and being unable to care for her granddaughter weighed on her heavily. She wrote letters to Eszter when she couldn't visit, though she was never certain if all of them were delivered. When Eszter turned 18 in May of 1992, she was released from state supervision. The Hungarian communist system had collapsed 2 years earlier, and the apparatus that had taken her from her family no longer existed in its previous form. She was given a small stipend, assigned a room in a shared apartment in Budapest, and told to register with the local employment office. She found work as a clerk in a bookshop. It was low-paying work, the kind of job that required no qualifications and offered no prospects. She lived quietly, spoke rarely to her roommates, and by all accounts, kept to herself. But she was searching for something. She was trying to find out what had happened to her parents. In the early months of 1993, Eszter began navigating the bureaucratic remnants of the former system, trying to access information that had been sealed for a decade. She went to government offices, filed requests for records, asked questions that most clerks either couldn't or wouldn't answer. Many of the archives were in disarray following the collapse of communist rule. Files had been moved, lost, deliberately destroyed. The AVH had been dissolved, and many former officers were unwilling to discuss cases from that era. But Eszter was persistent. She submitted formal requests under new transparency laws enacted in the early 1990s, laws that theoretically allowed citizens to access information about their families. She persisted when doors were closed, returned when she was turned away, asked again when she was told no. In September of 1993, she finally found someone willing to help. The person's name has not been preserved in any records, but according to accounts pieced together later, it was a woman who worked in an archives department that handled former AVH files. She took pity on Eszter, recognized that she was a young woman trying to understand what had happened to her family, and agreed to search for the file after hours. She found the case file. She told Eszter as gently as possible that her parents had been arrested in April of 1983, tried for treason, and executed in May of that same year. She showed her the dates, the charges, the verdict. She didn't show her the complete file. Much of it remained technically classified, but she gave her enough information to understand what had happened. And then she told her how the arrest had been initiated. She explained that the case had been triggered by a report filed by an AVH officer named János Molnár, whose source had been his 9-year-old daughter, Clara. She explained that Clara had heard the information from Eszter herself, that the report had led to surveillance, and the surveillance had led to arrest. Eszter didn't need further explanation. She remembered Clara. She remembered that lunch period in the schoolyard, the conversation on the bench, the words she'd spoken. She understood with complete and devastating clarity what she had done. She left the archives building and walked through the streets of Budapest. For hours, the city was still transitioning to its post-communist identity, old buildings bearing layers of history and neglect. It was early autumn, cool and overcast, and Eszter walked without destination, replaying everything in her mind. She returned to her apartment that evening. She didn't eat. She sat at the small table in her room and wrote a note. The note was brief. It explained what she'd learned that day, what her words had cost, what that knowledge meant. She didn't blame Clara. She didn't blame János Molnár. She didn't blame the AVH or the communist system. She blamed herself. She wrote that she'd destroyed her parents, that she'd taken their lives with her words, and that she couldn't live with that knowledge. On the night of September 14, 1993, Eszter Kovács took her own life in her apartment. She was found the following morning by her roommate. She was 18 years old. The note was discovered and filed with the incident report. Her death was officially recorded as suicide. There was no investigation, no follow-up. The communist era was over, the AVH was gone, and Eszter Kovács was just another casualty of a system that no longer existed. Her grandmother was notified. She claimed the body and arranged for burial. She had Eszter interred in a cemetery on the outskirts of Budapest, in a plot near where she hoped, though could never confirm, that her daughter and son-in-law had been buried. She placed a simple marker with Eszter's name and dates. She died 11 months later. The grief of losing her daughter, son-in-law, and granddaughter in the space of 10 years had broken something fundamental in her. She was 73 years old when she died, and according to neighbors, she'd spent her final months talking about Eszter constantly, wondering if there had been some way to save her. The story of the Kovács family remained largely unknown for years. The case file sat in the archives, accessible only to researchers with specific clearance. It wasn't until the late 1990s, when a Hungarian journalist researching AVH cases from the 1980s came across the file, that the details began to emerge. The journalist's work was published in a Hungarian historical journal in 1998. The article noted the tragic nature of the case, that a child's unguarded words had triggered events that led to her parents' execution, and ultimately, her own death. The article received limited attention outside academic circles. But the Kovács case represents something larger than one family's tragedy. It illustrates how Eastern Bloc surveillance systems functioned at the most fundamental level, how they relied on ordinary citizens to report on one another, and how even the most innocent sources of information could be weaponized by the state. János Molnár, the security officer who filed the initial report, was doing exactly what the system expected of him. He received information suggesting a potential crime, and he reported it through official channels. From his perspective, he was protecting state security. There's no evidence he ever expressed regret about the report. No indication he considered himself responsible for what happened to the Kovács family. He continued working until the system collapsed in 1989. His daughter, Klára, has never spoken publicly about the incident. Attempts to locate her for interviews have been unsuccessful. It's unknown whether she's aware of what happened to Eszter and her family, whether she carries any sense of responsibility, or whether she simply moved on from events that occurred when she was a child. The question of responsibility in cases like this is complicated because it requires assigning blame among individuals who were all, to some degree, acting according to the logic of the system they inhabited. Can an 8-year-old be held accountable for not understanding the consequences of her words? Can a 9-year-old be blamed for trusting her parent with information? Can a security officer be faulted for following the law as it was written? The answer perhaps is no, but that doesn't change the outcome. It doesn't bring back Laszlo and Katalin Kovács. It doesn't undo the years Eszter spent in state care, wondering where her parents had gone. It doesn't prevent the guilt that consumed her when she finally learned the truth. What the Kovács case demonstrates is how totalitarian systems function, not through individual malice, but through the collective participation of ordinary people who believe they're doing the right thing. János Molnár wasn't a villain. He was a man who believed in order, who thought he was protecting society. Klára wasn't malicious. She was a child who told her father something that seemed important. Even the AVH officers who conducted the surveillance and interrogations were, in their own minds, protecting Hungary from those who would betray it. But the AI system itself was designed to destroy anyone who attempted to step outside its control. It relied on fear, on surveillance, on the understanding that anyone could be watching, that any conversation could be reported, that any deviation from acceptable behavior could result in arrest. Laszlo and Katalin Kovács wanted a different life for their daughter. They wanted her to grow up in a place where she could speak freely, think freely, where her future wasn't predetermined by party loyalty and ideological conformity. They were willing to risk everything for that chance. But the system they sought to escape was all-encompassing, reaching into every aspect of life, turning even the innocent words of children into instruments of state control. By the time Eszter learned what her words had cost, the communist system had collapsed. The AVH had been dissolved. The ideology that had justified her parents' execution had been discredited, but none of that mattered to her. Her parents were still dead. Her childhood had still been stolen. The guilt was still unbearable. In the years since the fall of communism, stories like the Kovács families have emerged slowly from the archives. They're documented in historical journals, in academic studies, in the accounts of survivors. They serve as reminders of what life was like under systems that valued control over freedom, ideology over humanity, the state over the individual. There is no memorial for the Kovács family. Their names appear on no monument. Their story is known only to those who've researched AVH files from the 1980s. But their case, like thousands of others, represents the human cost of totalitarianism. The lives destroyed not by war or famine, but by a system that turned ordinary people into informants and ordinary conversations into evidence. Eszter Kovács was 8 years old when she made a mistake. She was 18 when she died believing she'd killed her parents. And in between, she lost everything.